All right, everyone. Welcome to Cyber Tech and Risk Identity Security Virtual Summit 2023. My name is Brian Lee. I'm the founder of Cyber Tech and Risk, and I will be the host for today's summit. You will hear insights from industry experts on topics like permissions management, identity governance, and the transformation of IAM. You can watch keynote presentations and panel discussion. You can also visit exhibit virtual booths and join community discussions. I hope you will enjoy today's summit. So let's start our summit with the keynote speech. Our keynote speaker is Neil Walker. Neil is an Entra Global Black Belt at Microsoft, where he is responsible for assisting customers on their identity journey. With over 20 years of experience, Neil has worked in various roles in security and identity, guiding many large enterprises to strengthen their security and identity posture. And Neil will talk about combating risky behavior in the cloud. All right, so I will give the control to Neil, so Neil can start his presentation. Excellent. Neil, all yours.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it. So thanks for having me in this morning. I'm going to be talking about cloud infrastructure entitlement management, right? So combating risky behavior with CIEM. Now, the product name for cloud infrastructure entitlement management at Microsoft is Entra Permissions Management. So I wanted to start the conversation before I dig into the detail. I wanted to give you just a brief description of both the Microsoft landscape as well as the market landscape as a whole. I think that'll be helpful in just providing context for what cloud infrastructure entitlement management is within the environment. So at a high level, Microsoft Entra is a brand category, right? So it's a newer brand within the Microsoft portfolio, and it's all of the identity elements, right? So Entra itself is a product family. It's newer to Microsoft. It includes some products that I'm sure you're familiar with and some other newer offerings as well, but it's just a family. It's an umbrella of products focusing on the identity elements within Microsoft. So when we look at that as a whole, right, it encompasses really 5 main elements within the platform. And again, the conversation is going to be focused on CIEM, but I just want to provide this context. So within the Entra umbrella itself, in addition to permissions management, which is the last one we're going to talk about, it includes elements like Azure Active Directory. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. There's other elements like Verified ID. Verified ID allows for ownership, user ownership and control of their own credentials, right? It's decentralized credentials in their environment. It also includes identity governance within the environment. So lifecycle management, access packages, that's been a key area of investment for Microsoft within the environment itself. Workload identities. So all of those conditional access policies, all of that security that you've come to know and love for your users, your groups, your human identities, we've extended that to your workload, your non-human identities as well. And then lastly, permissions management. That's what we're going to talk about today, right? Really uncovering those excessively permissioned identities in your multi-cloud environment, right? So at a high level, all of these elements make up the Entra portfolio. And within the context of Microsoft, keep in mind that there's an Entra portal, so you can access all of these elements here. And at the end of the conversation, I'll provide some resources for everyone to do additional, research and reading within any of these specific topics. So before I get started in cloud infrastructure entitlement management, when we leave this conversation and you go out there and you talk to analysts and you talk to security vendors, they know what cloud infrastructure entitlement management is. Over time, CIEM has evolved into really a broader framework, right? Into what we now refer to as CNAP. So CNAP, which is Cloud Native Application Protection Platforms, is really a set of integrated solutions, including CIEM. So I thought that was important to include that so that if you weren't familiar with any of the elements in this landscape, when you went to have those conversations, whether it's with analysts or your security vendors or Microsoft, you're going to see that in the context of Microsoft, we're within the Entra portfolio. And when you start looking at the industry as a whole, you're going to hear security vendors more and more talk about cloud infrastructure entitlement management as part of CNAP, right? And CNAP includes different elements, CSPM, infrastructure as code, cloud workload protection, right? All of these elements are a set of integrated solutions that comprise CNAP. So in the context of Microsoft, right, when we start talking about CNAP, right, we're talking about, some of the acronyms, and I know, well, you're all security practitioners, right? So you're probably used to the acronyms too by now, but at a high level, we're talking about things like posture management, cloud infrastructure entitlement management, DevSecOps, et cetera. So again, when you start doing that research, you start talking to analysts, and everyone's talking about CNAP, all it is some of these tried and true acronyms, these solutions that you're familiar with, right? These have all evolved into an integrated platform that's become CNAP. So I wanted to provide that background, but again, I want to emphasize that what I wanted to talk about today is really a solution that I'm extremely passionate about. And again, I'm also going to talk to this from both a Microsoft standpoint as well as an industry standpoint, which is cloud infrastructure entitlement management, right? That's where I really wanted to focus the solution or focus the conversation today. I think Brian alluded to the fact that at the end, I'm going to save a few minutes towards the end of the conversation. If there's any questions, please let me know. If we don't get to your questions, I can follow up with you offline as well. So, digging right in to cloud infrastructure entitlement management, I really want to start with, some of the challenges, right? So I don't think I need to tell anyone that's listening in on this conversation really what the sheer proliferation of identities in the cloud compared to what you had to contend with on premise has really done from a permissions management standpoint, right? You're contending with factors of thousands compared to what you had to contend with on premise, right? In addition to that, that center metric where we talk about greater than 90% of identities are using less than 5% of permissions granted, that one statement, I feel like it speaks volumes, right? We derived that metric working with dozens and dozens of organizations. When we're given the opportunity to kick the tires, and even with our customers, we drew that metric from working with these customers. And what we found is that only a fraction of permissions, high risk permissions granted, are ever used, right? From our standpoint, that's just unnecessary risk. And this is, again, I want to make sure a point of emphasis here is when I look at this, these are looking at historical usage patterns across all of your cloud environments, right? So this solution, Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management, Microsoft EPM, Entra Permissions Management, the brand name is looking at Azure infrastructure, AWS, Google Cloud, right? And what we're seeing is typically a fraction of permissions across all of your human, non-human identities are using a fraction of the permissions granted. And I also probably don't need to tell the audience that as it lends itself to the cloud, these high risk permissions can do serious degradation to your infrastructure, right? So from our standpoint, it's just unnecessary risk. It doesn't have to be that way if you can draw that visibility out of your environment. Now, one of the concepts that I wanted to talk a little bit about is what we refer to as the permissions gap, right? So the permissions gap, remember, we're looking at history, and I'll talk a little bit about how we derive that history from your environment. But we derive the history from your environment, and what we want to do is we want to be able to identify the delta between the permissions granted and the permissions used across all of your identities, right? We're not talking just in the context of human identities. We're talking about everything, right? We're talking in the context of Azure, we're looking at managed identities, applications, user groups, functions, AWS, we're looking at AWS roles, Lambda functions, in addition to the users, the resources, et cetera, right? So we're looking at all of the identities across the entire cloud infrastructure. And what we want to do is we want to map out what that permissions gap looks like. The permissions gap being the delta between the permissions granted and the permissions used. We want to be able to draw that visibility out of your environment and also give you the remediation framework so you can make that visibility actionable, right? That's what the permissions gap is. And that's one of the key elements that any cloud infrastructure entitlement management solution should be drawing out of your environment and generating recommendations around. So simply put, what is cloud infrastructure entitlement management, specifically Entra Permissions Management, right? It's a unified view into all of your cloud environments so that we can identify every action performed by every identity on every resource, right? That's what we're doing. Now, from that standpoint, in addition to providing that visibility, we'll also give you a suite of remediation tools so that when you define that remediation journey, you have a suite of tools with various levels of automation so that you can make this visibility actionable in your environment, right? That's what CIEM and Entra Permissions Management, that's what its charge is, and that's what we want to draw out of your environment by generating those recommendations specific to the environment. Now, what I wanted to do here is talk at a high level, just a few different use cases. Now, I want to emphasize here that every organization has different personas. But when I talk to organizations, I put a few use case slides in here just because everybody tends to understand and resonate. The problem statement resonates. The challenge is, well, who's going to do what in my environment, right? How do I operationalize this, right? You could have security teams, and those security teams might want to, I don't know, they want anomaly alerts, right, within your environment. If you look at something like the cloud infrastructure team, right, they're really concerned about who has access to their sensitive resources and what access do they have within the environment. You'll have other folks, identity and access management teams, right? They have the charge with maybe you have recertification campaigns. Wouldn't it be great if you had activity-based insights so that you could actually inject that into your recertification campaign workflow, right? So you actually knew when you were going through these campaigns what everyone was using over time, right? So at a high level, there's different personas. And when we work with organizations, we help drill into that, identify the personas in your organization, because it's one thing to have all of this data at your disposal, all of these remediation tools. You have to be able to operationalize it easily in your environment, or it's just going to be that much more of a challenge, right? Or then it's just another tool in your environment. So at a high level, I wanted to include a few use cases so that when I really drill into some of the problem statements, the recommendations, et cetera, you have some context that we do map these against the various personas in your organization to help with that operational challenge. So when I talk about Entra Permissions Management, I usually talk about it really in three different categories, right? Discovery, remediation, monitoring, right? I think every environment starts with the discovery phase. In most cases, most of the organizations I work with, they really don't know what they don't know, right? It starts with that discovery, being able to easily identify excessively permissioned identities by looking at their historical behavior within the environment. Once we derive that discovery, then we'll move into talking about a remediation framework, right? I've got all this discovery information. I've had these recommendation reports. I've set up my alerts. How do I make them actionable? That's what remediation is, right? Actually right-sizing, least privileging these identities within the environment, giving you the tools to be able to do that, right? Now, your remediation journey, admittedly, right, you're going to need various levels of automation. When you start your journey, you're probably not going to go to a fully automated framework from a remediation standpoint. You're going to want to build to that over time, right? So we provide a flexible set of remediation tools so that you can ramp up that automation over time. And then lastly, monitoring, right? I want to emphasize when we collect, model, make recommendations against the activity in your environment, this isn't a one-time effort, right? Your environment is fluid, right? These cloud environments are constantly changing. You're always adding new subscriptions, new AWS accounts, new Google Cloud projects. And we have to be able to persistently monitor these environments so that when your permissions change and you add new accounts, you add new projects, you add new identities, we're constantly refreshing our recommendations within the environment on a persistent basis, right? This is always ongoing. So specific to discovering and assessing your environment, right? One of the key elements is, well, I'm going to have thousands, whether you're a single cloud or you're multi-cloud, we're potentially talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of identities in your environment when you look at all the human, non-human identities, right? You need a way to prioritize candidates for remediation in your environment. So we have a metric, right, that we provide a holistic view and we assign a risk score. And what I mean by that holistic view is you can group your AWS accounts, your Azure subscriptions, your Google Cloud projects. You can group those in such a way that when we ingest those, we'll provide a risk score at the subscription project account level. And so that gives you the ability to really track your progress when you're going through your remediation, right? So for example, this permissions creep index, that's the risk score that it gets assigned both at the subscription project account level as well as at the individual identity level, right? So when you're tracking your progress, you might see that risk score at, a 95 week 1, hopefully week 2, you see a 75 or a 70. Week 3, it's down to a 50, right? You want to see that risk score go down over time as you're taking action against these excessively permissioned identities within your environment, right? And just so you know, when we assign risk, right, this permissions creep index, which admittedly has the unfortunate acronym of PCI, keep in mind that algorithm, what it's doing is the way we assign risk is we look at the permissions gap, right? We look at the permissions granted versus the permissions used. We look at the resource reach of a particular identity. Can it access 5% of the resources? Can it access 95% of the resources? And then there are other elements that will vary depending on the cloud. So for example, in addition on Azure, we'll look at the scope of the permissions. Are they assigned management group, resource group, subscription level? In AWS, we'll look at service control policies, boundaries, conditions. In GCP, we'll look at organizations and folders, right? We look at all of these elements and we assign risk, right? And again, that risk score is just to help you prioritize candidates for least privilege in your environment. So in addition to identifying these permissions holistically, right? So we'll provide the way that Entra Permissions Management works is we'll be able to provide you this guidance in a heat map, right? We'll plot all of your subscriptions, your projects, your GCP or your Azure subscriptions, your AWS accounts, your GCP projects. We'll plot all those on a heat map so that you can track your progress, right? That heat map will indicate on the graph where the areas of risk are. You can drill into those and then know what identities specific to those subscriptions, projects, accounts, where those candidates for least privilege lie, right? So when you look at that, both from the holistic approach, right, this particular screenshot, this view is just showing you a user view, right? Now, a user view may not be the most interesting, right? But if you look at the view here, where we're showing the task utilization, right, you can see the granted versus executed tasks. You can see the resource reach. You can see the risk score. You can drill into these identities. Specifically, if I were to click on those identities, you can see specifically what is attributing these identities that's assigning that high risk permission to them, right? So you can get all of that view, but my emphasis here is the screenshot showing users, right? But keep in mind, we provide a very consistent view, whether you're looking at users, groups, managed identities, applications, AWS roles, GCP service accounts, right? You're going to see the same detail and the same ability to derive that context from your environment so that you understand when you receive your alerts, when you're looking at the recommendation reports, this analytics area just allows you to gain visibility into the full context on why we arrived at the recommendation we made within your environment. So let's talk a moment about remediation. So remediation is a very flexible framework that allows you to take action on some of these visibility, right? So we provide out-of-the-box roll-up reports. You can customize these roll-up reports as well. We have a very robust alerting framework, but when you want to execute remediation, remediation could start with some manual efforts, right? Where, hey, we found a bunch of permanently assigned owner roles in your environment, right? You could use the EPM remediation framework to automatically remediate those within your environment, right? Simple use case. If I see the owner role permanently assigned in my Azure environment, remove it, right? Another area of remediation could be to create an activity-based role. I want to emphasize that I'm not suggesting you ever create an activity-based role for every single user in your environment, but if you have managed identities that use the same permissions over time, applications, AWS roles, GCP service accounts, right? Why? And we view them and we see that they have high risk permissions that they never use. What we can do is do an analysis of those identities, generate a set of permissions specific to what they've actually been using over time, right? Create an activity role or policy in certain cases to remove those high risk permissions because again, it's unnecessary risk. But remediation is, simply put, it's adding and removing roles, creating activity-based roles, but also giving you a very flexible framework to do that, right? You can do it manually, you can generate JSON, you could actually fully automate, adding and removing roles and policies within the environment, right? Just depending on where you are in your remediation journey. So lastly, I think I mentioned before that this isn't a one-time thing, right? You're going to be constantly updating, refreshing, getting new alerts, getting new roll-up reports from a monitoring standpoint. But I also wanted to mention that because of the fact that we're ingesting and modeling activity, probably doesn't do it justice to call this an interesting byproduct of modeling this activity, right? Because this is a really critical feature, is we can also detect anomalies in your environment, right? So remember, we have a baseline for how all of your identities behave in your environment. So when we see an identity just start, using different volumes of permissions, different high risk permissions, permissions from a different geography, right? Different time of day, however you want to set up this framework, when we see this anomalous activity, we can alert on that because we know how these identities behave. So it's easy for us to both allow you to customize these alerts, and we also provide a complete out-of-the-box framework from an anomaly detection standpoint as well. So the last piece of this, and again, I wanted to make sure that I save time to open it up for questions. It's really, really easy to get started with this, right? So as I mentioned earlier, whether you're talking to Microsoft, right, always encourage customers to test this out, right? Identify a few interesting accounts, subscriptions, projects in your environment, ingest that activity data, right? So just so you understand what we're modeling, in Azure, we're looking at things like the activity logs, the resource metadata, IAM user group role permissions, and all of the equivalents across the other environments, right? AWS, it's CloudTrail and Access Advisor data and some other complementary APIs, but we're collecting that data, we're modeling it, generating very prescriptive roll-up reports so that you can get a sense of where the risk lies in your environment, right? That's really what the process is. To put these configurations in place is typically less than 30 minutes, and then you can get a very comprehensive output specific to your environment, right? You'll know where the problems are. You'll know where you can potentially start your remediation journey. Really simple to do. Just take a subset of your environment, model it, and then you can get a sense of what the environment as a whole potentially looks like within your environment. So, last thing, when you generate those reports, this is sort of just a summary of some of the things that you should be looking for in your environment, right? Starting with the findings, right? And the findings can be, things around not just excessively permissioned identities, right? Inactivity, toxic combinations. In the context of AWS, you want to understand what your cross-account exposures look like, understand the implications, and then we'll help you with the best practices around how do you remediate some of these findings specific to the environment. So I wanted to make sure that I left a few minutes to answer any potential questions. So the last thing I want to stop on, I have a set of links for anyone that needs additional information. And again, I want to emphasize, I'm going to turn this over to Brian in just a moment for a couple of questions that I'll take time to answer. But just keep in mind, I think on this last slide, this is all of the available content with some short links. And just note my email address. Any questions I don't get to, feel free to reach out to me at any time. So let me come up for air and see, Brian, do we have any questions out there?
All right, thank you very much, Neil. So basically, I will take back the presentation and
Oh yeah.
yeah, so we do have a couple of questions here. One is because I think this question regarding the Entra is relatively new to some people. Many people familiar with the Azure AD, Azure Active Directory.
Yes.
Entra is a little bit new. So when coming to permissions management, you mentioned there are three stages, like a discovery, like a remediate, and monitoring.
Yep.
So especially for the discovery phase, how long usually take for a typical company to complete that process?
That's a great question. So I would say to put the configuration in place to start the ingestion probably takes about, let's just say 30 minutes. Now, we still have to transform and model the data. So depending on the size of the environment, I would, say, look, if we're talking in the context of dozens subscriptions, accounts, projects, or thousands, anywhere from, let's just say 24 to 72 hours before we fully transform and generate that first set of recommendations. But that time frame, I want to emphasize, is only the first collection, right? It's that initial collection that takes the time. As we refresh and generate new data every several hours, there's very little latency you're going to see. But the first collection could take some time to fully transform and model.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Neil. Another question, the other question really about kind of how this one fit to the overall cybersecurity ecosystem. I think the question really about, okay, so because you demonstrate there are some like a remediation, like a send alert, how that works with things like SIEM, like a security, like a Microsoft Sentinel, for
Yeah.
example. Yeah.
No, that's a great question. So everything I've showed you, or at least everything I've really talked about in the context of what's available in the console itself. But to that question, you're going to need to be able to ingest this data downstream, right? So a lot of organizations, not all, but a lot of organizations are going to want to take the alerting data, the auditing data, those recommendations we make, send those downstream to a SIM, for example. And that's all, that's part of the solution as well, right? So we'll be making some announcements down the road as far as what we're doing from an integration standpoint with SIM, with ITSM, and with some other platforms as well. So absolutely critical that we get this data downstream, and we've got some strategies for you to help you with that as well.
All right. Last question really is a bit interesting, but it's a very big topic. Is because recently Microsoft announced a lot of AI solutions. So things like I think Microsoft announced like a Copilot, right? So
Yes.
so once those are the AI solutions coming, how that works with this Entra and permissions management?
Yeah, so that's going to be a conversation that I'll have more detail on at a later date. I mean, anyone that's been involved with some of the Microsoft conferences this week at Build specifically talked a lot about AI. There's a lot on the horizon. Permissions management is no different. But Brian, to be transparent, I don't have target dates yet, but I will in the near term. So please invite me back when I do, when I can share some of those dates and some more detail on that.
Perfect. All right. I think considering the time, that's all the question we can answer.
Awesome.
Like Neil mentioned, we will record this section, this presentation, and you have one more chance to look at that, and also do follow up with Neil, and if you have any other follow-up questions.
Awesome.
All right. With that said, thank you very much, Neil, and thank you everyone online to watch this keynote session.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it,
All
everyone.
right.
Take care.
Okay. Bye for now.